for joining today's Chief Data and Technology Officer Summit. I'm Caitlin Halferty, Director of our IBM AI Accelerator and host of our Summit Series. In the spirit of peer-to-peer practitioner exchange, we have convened a dynamic panel of leading experts to share how they are building trust within their own organizations. We have an impressive list of Chief Data, Technology, and Operating Officers across government, technology, healthcare, digital, and automotive industry. My hope is you'll be able to pick up on tangible actions you can customize and implement within your own organization immediately. One of the most attended sessions from last year was AI ethics and trust. Our intent for today's session is to build on the vibrant conversations that this community has been driving and dive deeper into what it means to embed trust in a culture at key decision-making points along the AI lifecycle, empower employees at all levels of the organization, and explore how you can accelerate progress as leaders within your own organizations. To kick us off, I'll share two tangible examples of how we're building trust in data from where I sit in our Global Chief Data Office. In partnership with our Chief Privacy Office and legal colleagues, we unleashed 3 full-time subject matter experts who analyzed hundreds of data elements over 9 months to develop a curated and consolidated set of global privacy terms. This personal information taxonomy includes more than 150 data elements, including personally identifiable information and sensitive personal information. It drives consistency in terminology, it enhances reliability of compliance, and it can truly accelerate intelligent workflows. We're using and iterating on this ourselves internally. We've also made it available in the market. Second example of what we're doing internally is around our client and product master data. Our teams have consolidated over 40 data sources across finance, sales, procurement, and most recently, competitive install information, all to aid our sellers in better serving our clients. This was recently made available as a self-service capability. In doing this work, we saw a significant improvement in our data accuracy, eliminated 60% of seller time, preparation and planning, and sunset several legacy systems. I hope these examples are illustrative of how we're building trust through data internally. And as always, I would love to compare notes if you are tackling similar opportunities within your own company. Please chat in your questions and feedback along throughout today's session. For the questions we don't get to live, we will capture and address in a follow-up blog. Thank you for investing your time and expertise to join us today. With that, I will turn it over to David Matheson, CEO of CDO Club, to kick us off. Thank you so much and see you at the live Q&A.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and welcome back, Caitlin. It's great to see you again. A warm welcome to you all and especially to our special guest today, Global Chief Data Officer for IBM, Inderpal Bhandari. Welcome back to the program. Great to see you again, Inderpal.
Great to see you too, Dave. Thank you.
How can leading with trust differentiate companies in the market and provide a competitive advantage?
This is in fact going to be more and more the case that trust will differentiate companies in this market. One is the trust around data itself. Obviously, if you can't trust the data, you can't make the right decisions, etc. But because data is now increasingly the fuel for AI, there's also the trust around AI that's going to make this even more and more important. Now, the reason it becomes a differentiating factor is because trust eventually comes down to, I like to think of it as it's coming down to 5 things. One is transparency. And so just going back to that comment I made about AI, when you infuse AI into a workflow, the artificial intelligence system is going to absorb the IP, the intellectual property of that process for that company. Once the executives of the company realize that, they begin to understand that their partner here, their IT partner, potentially is in a position to disintermediate them. So they have to trust them. There has to be total transparency as to what they're doing, as to who owns the insights that come out of the data, et cetera, et cetera. So that transparency has to be very, very clean. That's one major aspect of it. Then there's the aspect that when you have these AI systems sitting in the workflow, you've got to be able to explain to the decision maker exactly what it is that you're proposing. What are the options? Why are these options being weighed more heavily than other options, et cetera, et cetera. So the explainability becomes a key factor of this. Then there's the robustness of the entire system. How good is the data that you actually have? And not only how good is the data that you actually have, but also how good are the models Are they being refreshed? Or are they old? All that stuff gets factored into trust, trusting the data, being able to make the right decision. Then you get into things like fairness, in terms of these models, are they actually behaving fairly with regard to the objects that are being analyzed? Because very often the objects that are being analyzed are actually people, they're actually consumers. And so it's for instance, if it's a recruiting system, it's critical that there be fairness and the lack of bias, and all that stuff comes in. So that's critical as well. And then finally, you've got privacy, because often this is sensitive data that you're dealing with. And so the data privacy and the security around that gets paramount. So those 5 factors, when you take them together, they encapsulate trust. But if you just reflect on that, you can see why that would become extremely differentiating for companies. If you have 2 competitors and one is high on those dimensions and the other is not, I don't care how good the actual algorithms are of the second party, they will lose that competition.
The biggest question we get is, how do you build a data-driven culture? What are the secrets? In your opinion, what operational and cultural changes are necessary to implement data-driven culture?
Yes, no, this is another very good question. One aspect we talked about with essentially the governance and the tools and having the standardization around the data so that you enable that data-driven culture. Because if the data itself is really not up to purpose and you don't make it easy for people to act upon the data, or if they can't trust the data, there's that aspect is there, right? So there's the enabling aspect. But the second piece is the aspect of empowerment.
Yeah.
People have to be empowered. Let's say that there is you have all the enablement in place for people to act upon data. But if they have to essentially go up the hierarchy to get permission, it means they could be overruled. It defeats the whole purpose. So the empowerment and the data-driven culture, in my view, that goes hand in hand.
Great program today. Thanks so much, as always, for your insights, Inderpal.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Dave.
I'm thrilled to introduce our next speakers, Shyam Sankar, the Chief Operating Officer at Palantir Technologies, and Daniel Hernandez, the General Manager for IBM Data and AI. Can you share what actions you're taking throughout the data lifecycle to help improve trust? Let's start with Shyam.
Well, we think about the best metaphor for this is really the tools and technologies that software developers use to manage the software development lifecycle. How do you deal with version control? How do you deal with the fact that you have tens of thousands of software engineers working on the same code base? I think the mantra is a little bit of treat data like code. We have these powerful tools. We have the semantics around things like Git, branching of data, unit testing of data. How do you develop a one-way ratchet on quality? So when you bring this all together, what it really means is having powerful tools that allow you to engage in Kaizen. How are we delivering our privacy controls? How are we monitoring bias detection? How can we revert to prior known good states? And how do we create an environment that enables and fosters collaboration across the organization, not just with the data engineers, not just with the data scientists, but enables that feedback loop with the line of business itself?
Thanks so much, Shyam. Same question for Daniel. Daniel, can you share what actions you're taking throughout the data lifecycle to help improve trust?
Look, in general, I agree with Shyam. Let's treat data as a first-class citizen, which means kind of treat it as we do with applications and DevOps, but in the data world. We call it data ops. I will tell you one issue that is affecting data quality that we're probably not having enough of a conversation around is the impact of copying data. We do that all the time. We take data from source systems, we consolidate it into data lakes, bring them into our cloud data warehouses, only to then subset them out for analytics, data science. And every step along that path, there's data quality issues. Right. The issue is there's never been an alternative that offered a better way forward. Luckily, and people like Gartner have been tracking architectural approaches like data fabrics, which help you access the data where it is. And if you've done all the quality treatment to that data, it means accessing high quality data, potentially in direct source systems, doing full lifecycle management in a disciplined, central way, and then copying the data only if you need to. So architectural techniques like data fabrics supported by technology with automation throughout, help you address some of the egregious issues related to data quality that are triggered by just simply copying data. And so that kind of stuff is how we're thinking about the problem space. And when we think about it and apply technology to it, we can go a long way in helping our customers deliver trusted data, in-supported decisions, automation, and more. That's what we're up to.
Shyam, how is your organization addressing these data privacy concerns?
Absolutely. It's the forefront of having any sort of utility or getting value out of data itself is having the requisite trust and the ability to govern that. And so I think there are really two things that we're thinking about. One is, how do you incorporate the governance itself into the software? So many times we're working with institutions where it takes 3 or 4 months simply to get access to data to answer a question that takes 3 or 4 minutes.
Yes.
And if you let that situation perpetuate, it's really corrosive to the culture of innovation. It encourages really smart people not to have interesting questions because it's just too hard to get the answers. So how do we get it so that these things are proportionate, but completely secure and governed and reliable and baked into the system? That's one component. The second major component that we're thinking about is to effectively protect the privacy, you have to think about purpose. Protecting data sets, row, column level ACLs, these are necessary, but I would argue perhaps not enough. You have to think about, how do we do purpose-based access control? And this allows you then to govern the models you're building and the data you have to understand the uses that have been consented. What is the purpose of your analysis, and is that purpose permissible? And that integrates with the first point around governance.
Daniel, love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, first of all, just with data privacy, we think about it in a multi-factored way. In general, we believe in precision AI regulation. We've been monitoring some of the emerging legislation that's coming out. So we have an entire body inside of IBM that is really representative of all aspects of the business, chaired by Christina Montgomery, that's really focused on AI ethics. What projects should we pursue with a fully represented body with clear decision rights is what the AI ethics board is about.
Yeah.
Second, there's a technology aspect to it. We are entrusted by our customers to consider and build in ethical AI. That means consideration around the entirety of the tool chain that we offer for data science, not just helping you build models that are deep biased, but doing the full lifecycle management around this stuff so that the original intent of those models are maintained as they learn and adjust to fast changing conditions in the wild. And then 3, we can't go at it alone. We do business with people that are like-minded, which is why we have a relationship with Palantir, as a for instance. We are highly aligned in how we approach the market, what our responsibility is to our customers and society as a whole.
How are you enabling your teams to leverage data for better outcomes?
Absolutely. I think this is the critical question, actually. And I think through no great genius, we've learned the hard way over the last 2 decades that it's much better to start with the decisions you actually do make, and then think hard about how you can expand the surface area of data you have to make a better decision. To put it another way, if you start analytics first every single time, it's very easy to get smarter without getting better. And what you really want to do is get better every single day and a little better tomorrow. And that's how you win. That's how you compete. And so I think there's a real opportunity for CDOs and for IT departments to partner up deeply with the business to understand the decisions they're making, to understand how you can wield the corporate data assets you do have to make better decisions today, and how to invest in the next generation of assets that would help your company win tomorrow and the day after that.
Thank you. Daniel, do you want to expand on that as well? How you're enabling your teams to leverage data for better outcomes?
Well, you got to start with the outcome first, which is don't go off trying to solve a problem that isn't anchored against a outcome that it's designed to drive. And if you don't have clarity around that, then you're putting good money after bad. Now, it's easier said than done. We're making an investment in our customers. Several years ago, we launched a data science elite team. This is basically PhDs, mathematicians, data scientists that we're making available to our customers so that they focus on what question they've got, outcome, give us a little bit, access to your data. We're going to bring the tools and we're going to bring the experts so we could run an experiment. So you could figure out whether or not there's something there for you to invest in. If there is, obviously we have the technology to help you along the way. That's, say, data science elite team has been so outstanding we're replicating that model for core data problems. I mentioned the data fabric as a way for you to grapple with the data copy problem that afflicts so many data quality programs. What we did for data science with the data science elite team, we're now doing for data ops with the data elite team. So a simple way for a customer to pick a problem, do some experimentation for us on our dime, and prove out whether or not an outcome is worth addressing.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you, Shyam. And now let's move over to the panel. First question, what's been your motto over the last 8 months? Move fast and break things, or slow and steady wins the race? Let's start with Iwao.
Move fast and break things.
Joy.
Be humble, try to solve real structural problems, and avoid flash and dash syndrome.
I'd like to think that we've always balanced the combination of the two, but certainly pivoting in healthcare and having worked previously for one of the vaccine manufacturers, being able to pivot quickly to new business priorities while still not breaking things.
So maybe walk fast, right? Speed walk. Vadim.
We're absolutely on the side of moving fast, experimenting, innovating, failing fast when needed, testing as much as possible. And that's what led us to success.
What are some of the best ways that organizations can build and create trust in data?
At GM, we take both an external and internal approach. So let me share with you each of those. On the external front, GM is a member of an organization called the Data and Trust Alliance. This was founded by Sam Palmisano, the former CEO of IBM, and Ken Chenault, the former CEO of American Express. It's a consortium, Dave, of 20 data-forward companies, including the 3 companies that I've been with, American Express, the NFL, and General Motors. Now, it was formed in early 2020. So the timeliness of the alliance largely stems from the somewhat unprecedented sharing of data, use of machine learning, AI, et cetera, that accelerated for all the right reasons, right? During the pandemic, our Data and Trust Alliance seeks to establish playbooks, best practices, training for the use of data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and other analytic techniques for good purposes, and really creating real use case examples for this. How can we, for example, use analytics in the HR recruitment and development process, but ensure that we're not creating unknowingly bias? How can we analyze aggregate level customer behavior changes as we return to a new normal to create better customer experiences? Internally, it's really a matter of principles and making sure that no one in your organization is overlooking the impact of an initiative on the trust that your company or your organization has with its customers. My advice, if it feels creepy, don't do it. If you can't explain it to your grandmother, don't do it, right? We have all seen marketplace examples of companies that spent decades building trust and goodwill with their customers, only to have it vanish overnight.
Joy, what are you finding are some of the best ways organizations can build and create trust in data?
Yeah, to me, it sort of falls into a 3-part play. So you can't possibly start to trust data if you don't create a framework for data visibility and access. You can't trust what you can't see or know, right? And that's so key. And we try to do that in the government sector, both through open data, but also internal data that needs to be shared, and creating documented, structured ways around accessing both that public data, but that more privileged data and confidential data as well. Another thing is really important. No one thinks this is sexy, but metadata and documentation is pretty much the hottest thing you can do around data, right? Because documentation, including caveats, like what are you worried about with this data set? What are concerns with it? And then even change alerts, right? When we used to publish and push out open data, we would warn people, change coming, because what you're trying to do by making data visible and accessible is create people trust it and start building things on it, right? But they can't do that if it's not predictable and managed in a way that allows people to use it through the documentation, but then also to plan as they're changing their tooling around it. And we see this play out all the time, right? we would have data pipelines, including during COVID, that would suddenly change on people, and it would throw off every downstream data product. You can't manage your data like that. So that's number two, the documentation, change alerts, and caveats. The last thing is sort of what I call transparent error recovery and closed feedback loops, right? So sometimes you mess up with the data, right? You mess up with the model, you mess up with the pipeline, and it's very important for your data team to be super transparent as soon as that happens. Whoa, what happened? Here's what we're doing. Here's how we're trying to recover. And then closing also feedback loops. So maybe an external folks, a lot of times for us, an external group would detect something. And what we'd say is like, oh, wow, thank you for flagging it. Here's what we're doing. And then when we finish doing it, putting that out there. And so closing that feedback loop. I'll give you an example that sort of weaves together as a data consumer. When I was building an elevation map in 2005 on the Sunday morning of Hurricane Katrina coming into New Orleans, I downloaded a data set from USGS. It was an elevation data set. Nowhere, they'd migrated the data, but not the metadata. I didn't know if the data was in meters or feet. So I built my elevation map, and it turns out I took the wrong guess. I used my knowledge of New Orleans, and I can't remember if it was meters or feet. Well, I made the wrong choice. Someone out there in the internet found my map, which incidentally ended up getting published all over the world, and said, hey, Joy, your map's in the wrong unit. And so documented it, put the note, put it out there, right? So you really have to close that whole loop to foster trust in data.
Vadim, what are your thoughts on creating and building trust in data over at Forbes?
Yeah, there are a few keys for me here. And the most important one is the data needs to be really accurate. Otherwise, there's not going to be any trust ever. It needs to be easily consumable and digestible by the stakeholders, which means that you should select the right tools for the job, both on the architectural side and the presentation layer as well. It's a big part of onboarding your stakeholders. 3, to me, when you analyze the data and then you present it, it needs to be in that business context. And the analysts really have to have the deep understanding of all the business goals around the data.
Yeah, definitely.
And the last one for me is that you need to know your audience. You really need to know what level of detail to showcase. You could go way too deep and lose the audience right away, or you can go too broad, right, if it's a technical audience. So you really need to know who you're talking to. Fortunately for us, in the last few years, we were able to get buy-in from stakeholders in the company and really earn their trust.
What are some of the ways you've helped to build and create trust in data?
Well, first of all, I'm going to tell Joy I'm one of those who I do find metadata sexy. So, from 2 decades ago when one of my clients failed an audit because they had no transparency, no lineage, no metadata. Wow. And it was a significant amount of effort to unwind what they were presenting, to working a number of years in financial services, which was very regulated. And certainly with the growing regulations over the last 15 years, it's required that level of transparency around metadata management, around data lineage, around provenance. It's become core to, I think, everything I've done in each organization. But I do find it sexy because, as an example, in one organization, our first big data lake was done in days because it was a fully engineered metadata-driven solution, which we worked with our technology vendor to go to a Hadoop-based structure and completely 100% harvest all the metadata we had. So I think that the pieces I emphasize here is know your stakeholders. One data catalog vendor I spoke to several years ago told me they were building for 26 personas. I don't know if anyone needs 26 personas, but make sure what you're building, if you're building for your data scientists, if you're building for your citizen data scientists, if you're building for your engineers, you're building for data governance, make sure, I think you should have one metadata catalog that can enable the different personas versus 4, 5, 6 different catalogs that don't speak to one another. So have that linkage. And then make sure that you're doing this in a collaborative way. I've always believed that collaboration between the data organizations, the technology organizations, and the business organizations end to end. Therefore, if you're building it together, there's much greater trust because you're delivering a solution everyone believes in. And they also have transparency into the quality of the data, the lineage of the data, the difference in a business definition versus the technical definition. So make sure that you have that collaboration model up front and you're doing it as really one team.
Thanks so much, Mark. How can organizations get buy-in across all interested parties? How do you prioritize everyone's needs and demands?
Let me take you through a three-pronged approach that I used at Amex, the NFL, and General Motors, and I'll sprinkle some examples in throughout. First is communications, and doing so in the vernacular of the business. I have found that the most important success factor in whether it's a stand-up of a data and analytics function, a transformation, or an acceleration of growth, is to make sure our organizations speak in the language of the business. Second, you need to have a defined investment plan against data exploration and analytic experimentation. Yeah. There are so many new pools of data coming in all of our collective directions. At General Motors, I created a chief data strategist role to ensure that we can quickly data engineer and almost productize and productionize these highly unstructured data sets so we can use them. And that's where our partnership with our IT teams in getting rapid proofs of concepts up and running, and at the same time have clear paths to industrial strength, production-ready operations. At the end of the day, for General Motors, the customer is at the center of everything we do. And with these new pools of data, we have a very, very unique opportunity at this point in time to reimagine the customer experience as we move towards a zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion future. And then the last part of that three-pronged strategy, which is most important, is investment in talent. We, in fact, at General Motors completely revamped our talent strategy. And many of you may have seen GM's recent announcement on work appropriately. After 18 months of working from home, we now know that for our work in particular, remote and hybrid work arrangements enhance productivity. Yeah. So we've in fact embraced it, and we now hire nationally as opposed to being focused in the Southeast Michigan area. We are receiving over 1,000 applications per month for our open positions. That's up 2.5 times from our Michigan-focused strategy.
Do you believe that by being transparent and open with your data, that your office fosters trust for all stakeholders, especially its citizens?
Something I like to flag around open data and in residents, we focus on residents of California. It sort of came from a world of overpromise, right? It's like, oh, this will magic solve the world. And the best way to destroy trust is to overpromise, right? And the reality is us just putting data out there doesn't magically solve the world. Increased use of data has actually decreased trust in many domains, right? So this notion, like it needs to be more than that, at least. And I'll answer this question from the sort of perspective of the government sector, where open data as this core means of trust, transparency, and accountability is, I always like to warn people that accountability, open data is part of an accountability and transparency framework that is a much larger ecosystem. There's so many other accountability channels in the public sector that I think more and more are actually starting to propagate to the private sector, because what we have seen of the impacts of model usage and data exchange and all of that. And, you know, not least of which is elections, right? We have elections as a major accountability mechanism in our country. We also have oversight commissions. We have independent auditors. We have the separation of powers. You know, when the executive branch proposes something, the legislatures question it. And there's lots of oversight commissions, many that I have testified at. There's public hearings, public records requests. There's so much more. So I always try to reframe that open data is just sort of a nub in a larger ecosystem. And I think the analogy for the private sector, as we're seeing with the AI oversight boards that some companies are setting up, what does it mean to have ethical standards around use of data and MI? What does it mean to be responsible stewards of data, right? I think we are in the early stages of maturing, sort of maturation of data trustworthiness and accountability and oversight. You know, one of my backgrounds is in design and interaction design and web design and information design, and usability is an undersung hero of trustworthiness. And so where I think the open data movement has suffered is that the usability of these data portals, and they were sort of designed with experts or developers in mind. I think they have sort of failed in terms of improving in usability. And I think when things are not usable, it undermines the credibility of any service. From basic, common, human-centered design things like, affords the right action, there's the appropriate cycle of feedback. These things, I do think in that case, the data catalog world of open data is still fairly immature, and I'm always threatening to start a company over it.
Thank you so much, Joy. Over to you, Mark, at Evernorth. What policies or guidelines have you implemented that build and create trust in data?
I think I'll start because Joy mentioned the word ecosystem. And for many of us, when we started our careers in data, we might have been talking about data marts or data warehouses. Then we expanded it into data lakes. Now we're talking about ecosystems, but I'm sure every panel member here would probably agree with me. Our ecosystems for data today are more external data than internal. When we started our careers, it was primarily internal. So the data we need to manage, govern, and build trust around, so much of it's not under our control. And certainly in the last decade with digitization, it's very different types of data that we have to bring together. And then we have to think of governing, and we now have lots of data exchanges, some that we control, some we may not control, some may be governed and have standards, some may not. So our challenge has just grown exponentially as the technology has changed at even probably a more rapid pace. But building a data foundation, starting with policies, hasn't changed. I mean, we still have to build basic data ownership, data stewardship. We still need to think about the data security, the data privacy and protection has grown exponentially. And since I'm a resident of Joy's state, it's one of the first states in the US to enact data privacy regulations. I was living in UK when GDPR came along. So our data protection and privacy regulations are growing exponentially around the world. And it's not aligned from country to country. It may not be aligned from state to state in the US and even within industries. So, but that foundation of how I thought about data privacy 20 years ago when HIPAA came about versus today, it's still the same type of foundation. We're still talking about metadata, even though we may call them data catalogs today, it's still the same metadata challenge of how do you profile, how do you classify data, then how do you integrate that into our processes, how do we measure data quality, how do we actually address data quality at source versus downstream, because in the digital world, downstream is going to be too latent and cause too many issues with integrity. How do we build strong definitional integrity? We used to call it mostly data modeling. We'd have business glossaries and technical glossaries, but we would have common models. But how do we have that definitional integrity end to end? And then architecture, as the technologies have changed, how do we maintain the integrity of our architectures and the transparency of what we do? So that found what I call a data foundation or foundational capabilities. That hasn't changed, and then it distilled into a set of policies. I think Cigna's done a very good job of bringing together a number of policies into one overall data policy, and then we certainly have prioritized within that and built governance around that in my short tenure within Cigna and Evernorth. But those foundational capabilities haven't changed. The challenge of the ecosystem has changed.
Yeah. Vadim, in your experience, what role, if any, does the Chief Technology Officer play in building and creating trust in data?
Business intelligence team and data team reports up to me because at Forbes, technology and data is at the core of everything we do, and they have to work together. Technology team is definitely a vital role and plays a vital part in building and creating that trust in data. We have data science team, data engineering team, insights team that working really, really closely together and building variety of different data products. We focus on architecting and bringing to life a very comprehensive first-party data solution that has really changed the way we look at our audience. And it really lets us understand user segments, everything they do on our site at the deepest level. We've also created a very powerful analytics engine for our publishing platform that really makes our journalists' lives easier and gives them these deep insights. We obviously always releasing a lot of different dashboards that are really used across the company. And we focus on data science, and we have over 20 different machine learning models right now already running in production. and we're constantly trying to innovate and improve. So yeah, to your question, technology and data work hand in hand at Forbes.
As GM's data evangelist, you serve as a trusted business advisor to senior management and all the stakeholders there. How do you balance the need to provide real-time data to stakeholders with that slower moving, governance and compliance restrictions needed to make sure that the data is trustworthy?
I had the good fortune of working in many different industries. As we think about the healthcare industry, as we think about financial services, data governance, data catalogs, metadata, they're critical to the very core of the business models that are using, right, these data assets and processes. As I move to companies like the NFL, like General Motors, they tend to be nice to haves. If you're a bank and you don't have data governance, you're out of business. Same thing for a healthcare company. Not necessarily true of a sports and entertainment company, not necessarily true of a company that manufactures vehicles. The second is transparency and what I think the industry term is AI explainability. Once those AI models are out there, they're often extremely difficult to communicate to senior leaders. What are the inputs? What are the outputs? It tends to look like a black box, and then senior leaders often make the decision, well, you know what, that's interesting, but I'll stick with my old school solution. So there's a heavy need in AI transparency, AI explainability.
And it's not just for internal leaders, as you rightly point out, but also regulators. If you can't explain those AI algorithms and what's in that data, you're in trouble. Before you were a chief data officer at the state of California, you were chief data officer for the city and the county of San Francisco. If I say, 30,000 employees, 50 lines of business, you launched a couple of things that I thought were really, really important at the time and still today. One was data science as a service. And the second was the Data Academy, which was, your low-cost training program to lift data skill sets, which I believe has saved up to $11 million in staff time. So I was wondering, do you want to give us some examples of why data science as a service has improved outcomes, or maybe a little bit more about the training programs that you implemented back then to help build trust in data?
Yeah, and maybe I'll answer that in terms of how we architected and engineered trust throughout the life cycle of a data science project. When we offered data science as a service, the business was like, what are you doing? You're in our way. And so what we had to do was really offer a distinct value proposition from what they were doing in the language of business. And I don't have time to unpack that, but it had something to do with truffle pigs and project topologies and training our business how to sniff out good data science projects. But by distinguishing this service as something that could help them in putting it in their language was the core of building the trust. The next piece was, as we all know, ethics and use of algorithms and bias is a huge issue. So this is where we introduced what I call process as security blanket. We developed in partnership with Harvard and Johns Hopkins, the ethics and algorithm toolkit, which there was no practical way to manage that risk at the time. So we developed a very practical way that would allow us to, that borrowed from, one of my backgrounds was in information security risk management, borrowed from the risk management world of, hey, who are we impacting? How? At what degree and scale? And then how can we mitigate that risk and the ethical risks of our use of AI? Is our use of the data consistent and appropriate with the original collection? What are the accountability risks? We talked about how explainable it is, but it's also how auditable it is and what is the level of automation? How human mediated is the algorithm? And then lastly, of course, making sure we take into consideration not only the technical biases in the data, is it representative, but then the historical and societal bias. Is some of the data we're collecting an artifact of bias itself? The third play we did is trust starts with what we called context and user research design. If we're going to go in and be introducing a model into our business, we need to spend a lot of time understanding how that business works and then reflecting that back to them. So we would, for each data science project, develop a user and context research plan where we would sit down and understand their business process, reflect back, say, hey, here's where data science could sort of sneak in. The next piece starts with EA. I see way too many data science and ML people. They disappear into what I call the data science cave. They build their cute little model. They pop out one day and the business is supposed to be like, oh, wow, I love it. Well, we like to spend instead a lot of time in exploratory analysis where we're gently unpacking the data in partnership with the business. And this allows us to not only build trust in how we're building the model, what features we're selecting, what thing we're actually trying to predict an outcome. It also allows us to identify the data quality issues with the business and correct around and with them. And you can't do that if you don't spend time in EA. The next piece is you're going to have model outputs. We have a huge range of organizational contexts in which you could be putting the model output into. You have to do user research, design, and testing and usability testing on your model output to ensure the business can actually adopt it. And you need to be transparent about that design phase. And then lastly is what I call the virtuous solicitation cycle, right? When we're trying to build trust in this service, it's great to bring our prior clients with us and tell consistent stories about data science and how it's impacted the business. What was the business challenge? What were the data insights or the data science work that we did? What was the service change? And then what was the result? So we'd codify around this storytelling language to sort of build trust with future clients and then bring them into the rest of that 5-part play.
How do we best collect feedback from users in order to correct this unintentional bias in design or decision making, and so that we can improve trust in data?
Well, I think Joy touched on it with the partnership with our businesses. To me, data governance has always been a business-led discipline. And so how do you construct your data governance? Was it's business-led, business-owned? And one organization, I had the controller of the firm who had to report directly to the SEC on financial reporting. She was our head of governance, and her title was the chief data steward of the firm. She was also the controller. I can remember inheriting in one financial organization a homegrown data governance platform for all of our models throughout the firm. Why did we have a homegrown? Because at that time, which was a little more than a decade ago, there were no commercial solutions to govern models. And fast forward less than 5 years ago, when I was reading the GDPR, the General Data Protection Act in the EU, the draft regulation less than 5 years ago. And if you actually read word for word deep in the regulation, you could see if you wanted an automated, analytically driven decision, you would have to evidence that model. And at that time, I talked to every major technology vendor and a number of startups. Not one had ML model level governance, and only one had a product in the pipeline. This was 4.5 years ago.
Right.
So, that just shows you how quickly things are changing, the level of governance we have to have. If it's business led and it's in a partnership, you start building that transparency and you start talking about the biases in what you're doing. And then you build out the level of governance for the bias to reduce the biases over time. But it starts with that partnership.
Now that you've launched and you've got the new CMS, how are you enabling your teams to use and trust business data?
Yeah, number one for me is to really make data easily accessible and really democratize it. We not only giving our journalists deep understanding of the trends and how their content is performing, but using AI assistant, we're giving them valuable advice on how to improve their traffic, how to improve their engagement. Also, Iwao mentioned deprecation of third-party cookie. I'm really happy that we do have that first-party data platform. I think that's where it all starts, right? Get all the data into your data lake, understand it, and then you'll see the benefits. You'll see what to do with it. We were able to provide really insights and performance metrics to our advertising partners and connect them to the right audience segments that using ML and AI, we're able to scale as well. And on the consumer product side, we've built propensity models that allows us to connect the right users with the products that they're really looking for. So understanding of data, deep understanding of data, and really figuring out what your audience want, what user experience they want, what kind of personalized content to provide to them is really critical for the success of your organization.
Obviously, given the pandemic and COVID-19, wondering, has it, 1, accelerated, 2, changed, or 3, shifted your strategy in regard to building and creating trust in data? And will any of those changes remain permanent? Iwao.
Yes, for sure. And particularly focus on talent and the focus on agile development.
Yes. Joy.
Yes.
Good one-word answer. How about you, Mark?
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think the agile collaborative development partnership is critical.
Vadim.
It has definitely accelerated, will continue to accelerate, and it's amazing to see that everyone in the company understands the focus on the data and how important it is.
Great. Well, thanks so much, everybody. We're going to get started with the live Q&A, which begins right now. Thanks so much to everybody. You know, we started the IBM CDO, CTO Summits in 2020 last year. And for this event, we hit a record number of registrations. I owe it to all the speakers and this great content and a fabulous topic. So great session, everybody. Really, really sounding good. One of the things that really stuck out for me was outcomes. You know, Daniel mentioned to start with the outcome and work your way backwards from there. And I thought I'd love to get, you know, all of your feedback on that one. So this is the most important point, right? And I know some of you already touched on it, but maybe we'll flip the order and we'll start with Joy. You know, make sure you're unmuted. So I'd start with Joy. You know, Joy, what are your desired outcomes for your office, and how are you servicing and prioritizing your very different constituents and stakeholders?
Yeah, our outcomes are we have a statewide data strategy, and it's structured around the analogy that in order to successfully navigate the data landscape, we have to intentionally build the roads, craft the rules of the roads, and boost the drivers and the transit riders. And so our high level outcomes are around achieving those pieces of making sure people can access data when they need it, and they have the skills and ability to use that data effectively. And then the outcomes are taken on a case-by-case basis, right? Like when you build an algorithm, what's the ROI on it? What did it change, right? And what was the second part of your question, David?
Yeah, it was just how do you service and prioritize all those different stakeholders?
Yeah.
I mean, my God, every resident.
No. What we look for is one, shared problems across business units. So as the central data team, what are the shared structural barriers to data issues? Along which that people perceive as shared joint problems, that we identify where we can pull levers to shift the problem. And that's how we prioritize the space in which we focus on as a central data team.
Fantastic, Joy. Thanks so much. And you know, we'll flip the order. We'll go to Vadim next. Vadim, I recently saw the announcement about Lynn Schlesinger, the former Forbes CMO, is now appointed Chief Customer Experience Officer, reporting up to you and your team. So I guess that relaunch of the website and the CMS and the editorial tools has really paid off if they've got the Chief Experience Officer reporting up to you guys. So kudos to you. You know, same question. Can you share Forbes' desired outcomes and value? And how do you define success when building trust in data?
Yeah, that CXO role is a new created role for us, and it really highlights the importance of user experience for the company. And that is one of the parts of the success for us, right?
Right.
What's really interesting is that role is laser focused on using the data-driven insights and analytics to create that best-in-class user experience. And regarding how do we measure success, right, in data, for internal stakeholders, it's the adoption rate of all the tools and services that we created. It's really been transformational for us to see how our stakeholders and everyone inside the company are using data more and more when making those decisions. And that's another part of the success story. And for our broader audiences, we A/B test a lot. We look at the data obsessively every day. And based on that data, we create those products and user experiences. And honestly, the loyalty and user engagement on our side is the biggest indication of our success.
Absolutely, Vadim. And you know, you're competing not only with other traditional media companies, but the BuzzFeeds of the world, all these really, you know, internet-based companies that are data-driven. So, you know, you got your work cut out for you there, right? Iwao, given your stakeholders over at GM, and maybe touch on, you know, your work at the NFL before that, and in the context of trusted data, what are the desired outcomes for General Motors?
Sure. Thanks, Dave, and thanks for having me. Actually, before I talk about GM, we have both an inside and an outside focus there. Just wanted to build on what Vadim was saying about the customer experience. We at GM and certainly at the NFL and American Express, we had a very similar focus on customer experience. You know, here at GM, we have a platform that we call Voice of the Customer. And it's essentially the single source of truth. So I find single source of truth, information dashboards, business intelligence tools are really critical, right, from a customer experience perspective. And I think Joy, you also touched upon that as well. From a GM point of view, I'd take you through a couple of things, Dave. Inside GM, we've really been prioritizing the skill set, particularly from our data professionals, on how to talk about and present data. It sounds easy. It does very hard, right? Having our data teams talk in the currency of the business, talking about top line revenue, contribution margins, cost avoidance, even part number level operational KPIs, right? These are all the language, the words in the language that our business teams know and love very well. So, so that's one part of the Insight program. The other is in ensuring that all of our executives become literate in data and analytics. We've in fact invested in professional development tools, and they're available to all GM employees, regardless of their role or function. I was actually at our communications team town hall this morning, we've officially launched that program, because we really love empowering all employees to learn about how to work with, how to interpret data, how to present it. Outside of GM, we do want to make sure our customers choose to do business with us because they know customer data privacy, much like Joy was saying, right, is a top priority for us. With customer trust, we can create leading technologies and innovations that deliver awesome world-class experiences. And data and analytics are certainly key to unlocking this. Similar to Joy's example, GM has had its OnStar program for 25 years. And that's been all about customer trust, particularly around safety and security as a core part of the GM brand. And now we're expanding into new offerings based on the data and the insights. For example, think about being able to track your vehicle along the assembly line as it's being built, right? It's a real big passion point. Vadim, it goes back to the customer experience point. We actually do this today from a Cadillac Escalade perspective, so you can actually track your vehicle being built. So, to me, at the end of the day, the customer is at the center of everything we do. With new data pools coming our way, with existing data pools, we really have a very, very unique opportunity to reimagine the customer experience. We build the trust, and we drive ourselves towards a zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion future.
Fantastic, Iwao. And again, not unlike Vadim, automaking used to be a very conservative industry. Look at all the innovation going on between electric vehicles and alternative vehicles and Uber and self-driving cars. What an exciting time to be at GM. So kudos to you and the team there. And another conservative industry, a regulated industry, Mark over at Evernorth. You gave so many great points in that session, Mark. Thank you so much. And you also brought up the fact there's so many different personas and stakeholders. So I'm wondering, how do you at Evernorth deal with that complexity and deliver trusted data, especially in a regulated environment? And most importantly, what are your desired outcomes at Evernorth?
Well, I think I touched on it during the early part of the session. This is a balance. This is a balance on that foundation, and let's don't mistake a foundation with something that can be done easily. A good data foundation takes time. It takes investment for governance to mature and to build all the components. But how do you balance that with finding value quickly in the right areas? And that value could be risk and regulatory based. It could be revenue and growth based. It could be cost-based and taking cost out of the system and really reducing your OpEx. So to me, it's always balancing, getting that foundation, which will really sustain a data and analytics program long term, with how to get that value, maybe very outcomes focused on what you can do quickly and rapidly.
Absolutely. Hey, and give my thanks and regards to Gina Papush, who I think is the Chief Data and Analytics Officer there at Evernorth. She is fabulous. We got to get her on one of these programs. Thank you so much, Mark. Over to Daniel. Daniel, great points. I really enjoyed your comments about the IBM's data science elite customer engagement team. So maybe not focusing on IBM's outcomes, but focusing on your customers' outcomes, right? So can you elaborate, maybe provide some examples of this in practice, such as, how do you work through the journey with clients to help them determine and identify ideal outcomes and value?
The data science elite team is constructed to do a pretty simple set of experiments for customers that either don't have the ability or don't have the patience, or maybe don't even know whether or not to spend any money and time and attention on a particular problem. It's simply a way for us to give to them methods to run those experiments basically risk-free. So they bring a problem, the bigger the better. They help us with whatever data we need. We're going to bring the skills, and we're going to bring our own tools. Watson Studio, as a for instance, we've got on any given day dozens of these projects going on. Some contemporary examples of the outcomes we delivered: Highmark Health, they're delivering service to many of us. Sepsis is something that afflicts everyone around the world, not particularly with the same degree of risk and exposure, but it's a big problem. 50 million people are afflicted every year, 11 million die. And the question that they pose to us is, given the member data, are there methods for us to begin to predict susceptibility to sepsis so they could do something about it? Now, the implications for them is, set aside the high stakes, we're going to save lives economically. It's also something that they could benefit from through reduced cost of care, getting in front of the sepsis issue. So we're able to build models using their features inside of their member data and prove there's a reliable way for us to predict it. One example, high stakes, obviously. Another less high stakes example, and this is really driven by where we're just coming out of, where everybody's working from home. Engagement at work is, I would say, arguably at I won't say an all-time low, but certainly not at all-time high. And we had a customer that came to us and said, we have an army of people that are dealing with mundane tasks, essentially building legal hierarchies within their business. It's taken them 12 days to construct a single one, labor intensive. Are there ways for us to begin to automate that, increase the accuracy and quality of these legal hierarchies? And we build a model, it's not saving lives or anything like that, but it is saving days of time. We could do it in minutes, what would otherwise take in 12 days. And for the people that used to do this work, they're no longer dealing with the drudgery of it all, and they're happier. So I don't know how you put a dollar amount on that, but it's certainly an outcome that those employees are benefiting from. And then Lloyd's Bank, also an insurance company, they're dealing with claims. And claims, if you're ever issuing one, as a customer, isn't particularly a delightful experience. You have a problem, you need help with it. The question that they pose to us is, given a combination of structured and unstructured data, the claim itself being unstructured mainly, can we predict the outcome, help the agent that's doing the claims processing with the next best action? And even if they couldn't drive an outcome immediately, could they route more efficiently so that the end customer experience is as delightful as it can possibly be under a claim scenario? And we're able to do that. So dramatically reduce cycle times, better outcomes for the customer, everybody benefits. Just small examples here.
Excellent, Daniel. Thank you so much. And maybe over to Inderpal for some, closing thoughts or comments on our session today. I certainly think Daniel's examples of, helping customers directly through the IBM Data Elite team, you've been so transparent and helpful to our community, all the CDOs and CTOs out there, in doing what you do best internally, but then sharing those experiences with the world. So thank you so much for everything you do, Inderpal. And wonder if you have any closing thoughts for today.
Just a tremendous panel today, Dave. So really thank everyone for all your comments and all your insights. So I won't add any more to what the panelists said, but I will point you to one thing. The chat stream, is tremendously insightful for this particular session.
Yeah.
And I would in fact suggest that for those of you watching who haven't actually taken a look at the chat stream, please do.
Yeah.
And perhaps Dave, we might even be a good idea to take that chat stream and then circulate it to the attendees.
I'm going to do that. Yeah, that comes saved with the Zoom registration report. So we'll get that. And by the way, Merrill Albert, everybody in chat, Satyam Priyadarshi, the CDO at Halliburton. Hello to Deirdre McGlashan. We had so many CDOs and CTOs on this call today. And again, record number of registrations. So I guess I'll leave it to Caitlin to close out and thank everybody. But I agree with you, Inderpal. This was, I believe, one of the best panels we've ever had. Great content, great information. A lot of registrants getting a lot of useful information out of it. So thanks to you, everyone, and over to Caitlin to close it out.
Thank you, Dave. I think you've captured it. So we will, I see some heated debates in the chat, which was fantastic. We will capture that and distribute to all. We have a couple questions here. We'll make sure we get those addressed. So again, best attendance, high engagement, fantastic. Thank you for joining us, lending your time and expertise. Of course, our next session, we will convene, never too early to mark on your calendars, October 20th. And there we will be talking about balancing innovation and growth. So we'll continue this conversation. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Fantastic panel. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.